The man they called Thornton cleared his throat, a sound like gravel grinding in a pan. His voice cut through the shimmering heat of redemption. Gulch, thin and sharp as a shard of glass. 2 prime workers, he announced to the dusty collection of onlookers at the train station. Hardy stock. Fully indentured and sanctioned by the Transcontinental Railroad Company. He held up a sheaf of papers, waving them like a banner of righteousness. But he was not selling mules or equipment. He was selling children. They stood beside him on the splintered platform, a boy and a girl, twins by the look of them, no older than 8. They were bone-thin, dressed in rags that hung from their small frames, and smudged with the kind of grime that came from days of travel and neglect. They clutched each other's hands, a single, 4-handed knot of terror in a world that had proven itself monstrous. The boy, Leo, stared at the dirt with vacant eyes, his small jaw set in a line of hopeless defiance. The girl, Ilara, kept her head bowed, her dark hair falling like a curtain over her face, hiding tears she no longer had the strength to shed. They were a pair of sparrows in the shadow of a hawk. At the edge of the sparse crowd, a man watched. He was a specter from another world, a man who belonged to the granite peaks that loomed over the town, not the dusty streets. His name was Silas, though few in the town knew it. To them, he was simply the mountain man, a figure who descended from his solitude only a few times a year for salt, flour, and steel traps. His face was a landscape of its own, carved by wind and sorrow. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a stillness that unsettled people. It was the stillness of profound loss, a quiet so deep it had swallowed all the noise of the world. He had come for supplies, an unwelcome but necessary chore that forced him back among the living. He had not intended to linger. He had not intended to feel anything at all. But the sight of the children struck him like a physical blow. It was a phantom pain, an echo of a life torn away from him. He saw the slight tremble in the girl's shoulder, the way the boy squared his small body as if to shield her from the leering eyes of the world. He saw a ghost of his own son, Caleb, in the boy's defiant posture. He saw the ghost of his wife, Anya, in the fierce, protective love that bound the twins together. The memory was a white-hot poker to his soul. The fire. The smoke. The screams that became silence. He had built a fortress of solitude around that memory, a high wall of granite and ice. Now, 2 small, shivering children were threatening to tear it down stone by stone. Thornton was speaking again, this time to a burly foreman with a face like a slab of raw meat. Their contracts run 15 years. The railroad provides subsistence. You provide the labor. A fair price for a long-term investment. The foreman grunted, looking the children over as if they were livestock. He reached out a thick, dirty finger and tilted the boy's chin up. Leo flinched but did not cry out. A cold, clean rage, an emotion Silas had thought buried long ago, began to smolder in his chest. It was a familiar fire, but one he had not felt since the day he lost everything. It was the fire of a protector. Thornton named his price. The foreman nodded, reaching for a leather pouch at his belt. The transaction was about to be sealed. A life of hard labor, of misery and abuse, was about to be cemented for 2 souls who had already suffered enough. Silas moved. He did not rush. His steps were deliberate, each one landing with a quiet finality on the dusty boards of the platform. The small crowd parted for him, sensing the shift in the air, the sudden drop in temperature that seemed to emanate from his very being. He stopped before Thornton and the foreman. He was taller than both men, broader in the shoulders, a man shaped by the wilderness itself. He spoke one word. His voice was a low rumble, like distant rockfall. "Stop." Thornton turned, his expression a mixture of annoyance and surprise. "What is this?" "This is official railroad business." Silas's gaze was not on Thornton. It was on the children. He saw the flicker of something in the girl's eyes as she peeked through her hair. It was not hope. It was just confusion, a momentary pause in her terror. "They are not for sale," Silas stated. It was not a plea or a negotiation. It was a fact. Thornton laughed, a short, ugly bark. He brandished the papers again. I have the contracts right here, friend. Legally sanctioned indenture. They are assets of the company. He spat the word assets as if it tasted of coin. Silas's hand went to the heavy pouch at his own belt. It contained the profits of a full year of trapping, of lonely work in the high, cold mountains. Gold dust and a few heavy coins. It was his stake for the coming winter, his insurance against the world. He untied the leather thong and emptied the contents onto the flat top of a nearby shipping crate. The gold glittered in the harsh sunlight, a small, brilliant pile of freedom. It was more money than most men in Redemption Gulch saw in a year. I will buy their contracts, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Double what he offered. The foreman froze, his hand hovering over his own pouch. Thornton's eyes widened, the greed unmistakable. He looked from the gold to Silas, then back to the gold. The legal papers suddenly seemed less important than the glittering pile on the crate. This is highly irregular, Thornton stammered, but his resolve was melting like snow in spring. The contracts, Silas repeated. Sign them over to me. Thornton, mesmerized by the gold, snatched up the papers. He produced a pen and, using the crate as a desk, hastily scrawled a transfer of ownership on the back of the documents. He pushed them toward Silas, his eyes never leaving the prize. Silas ignored the papers for a moment. He looked at the children. He had just bought them, an act that tasted like ash in his mouth. But it was the only way. He had not bought them to own them. He had bought them to save them. He pocketed the contracts and gestured to the gold. It is yours. Thornton greedily swept the dust and coins into his own bag. The deal was done. The foreman grumbled and backed away, unwilling to challenge a man like Silas, or a price like that. The crowd murmured, their whispers a mix of shock, awe, and confusion. Silas turned his full attention to the twins. They were staring at him now, their fear mingled with a terrifying uncertainty. He was a new monster, bigger and quieter than the last. He crouched down, trying to make himself smaller, less imposing. It was an awkward, unfamiliar movement. His gaze was steady, his face unreadable. Come, he said. The word was soft, but it was still a command. He held out a large, calloused hand. Not to grab them, but as an offering. After a long, silent moment, the little girl, Ilara, let go of her brother's hand and took a hesitant step forward. Then another. The boy, Leo, followed a half-step behind her, his small body still a shield. They stopped just out of his reach. He had claimed them. He was responsible. The thought was both terrifying and strangely grounding. He stood up, turning his back on the town, and began the long walk toward the mountains. He did not look back to see if they were following. He simply trusted that they would. And they did. Two small shadows trailing a giant, away from the railroad and toward the unknown. The journey up the mountain was a silent ordeal. The path was steep and rugged, a trail known only to Silas and the animals whose domain he shared. The air grew thinner, cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. Silas walked ahead, acutely aware of the two sets of small, shuffling footsteps behind him. He did not speak. Words were a currency he had long since abandoned, and he did not know what to say to frightened children. What comfort could he offer? His own heart was a barren landscape. He stopped by a small, clear stream bubbling over mossy rocks. He unslung his canteen, filled it, and offered it to them. Leo looked at him with suspicion, but Ilara, her throat raw with thirst, crept forward and drank greedily. Then Leo drank too. Silas merely nodded, corked the canteen, and continued on. Higher up the trail, where the rocks were loose and treacherous, Ilara stumbled. A small cry of pain escaped her lips. Without a word, Silas turned back. He gently examined her ankle, his touch surprisingly careful for a man with such large, rough hands. It was not broken, only scraped. He looked at her small, exhausted face. Then he looked at the towering peaks ahead. He scooped her up into his arms. She stiffened, a gasp of fear caught in her throat, but he paid it no mind. He settled her against his chest and began walking again, his stride even and powerful, as if her slight weight were nothing at all. Leo scurried to keep up, his eyes wide, watching this strange giant who carried his sister as if she were precious. They arrived at his cabin as dusk was painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. It was a simple, sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs, nestled in a small clearing and backed by a sheer wall of granite. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a lonely plume against the vast wilderness. Inside, it was sparse but immaculate. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire already crackling within it. There was a single bed with a bearskin cover, a rough-hewn table with 2 stools, and shelves holding a few tin plates, dried herbs, and neatly stacked firewood. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something else, the clean scent of solitude. He set Elara down gently on one of the stools by the fire. He motioned for Leo to take the other. From a hook on the wall, he took down a pot and began to prepare a meal. He moved with an economy of motion that was both practiced and graceful. Venison stew, thick with wild carrots and potatoes. He ladled the hot stew into 2 tin bowls and set them on the table. He gave them each a wooden spoon. He did not eat himself. He simply stood by the hearth, watching them, his presence a silent, looming guard. The twins ate with a desperation that twisted his gut. It was likely the first hot, decent meal they had eaten in a long time. When they were finished, they looked up at him, their faces slick with broth, their eyes still wary. Silas went to a wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He opened it. The scent of dried lavender and cedar filled the small cabin. He pulled out a thick, soft quilt, its colors faded but its stitching intricate. It was Anya's. He had not touched it in years. He laid the quilt on the floor near the warmth of the hearth, folding it to make a soft pallet. He looked at the children. "Sleep," he said. They huddled together on the quilt, pulling its worn softness up to their chins. Elara's eyes were already closing. Leo fought it, trying to stay awake, to watch the strange man. But exhaustion won. Soon, they were both fast asleep, their breathing soft and even in the quiet cabin. Silas did not take his bed. He took a spare blanket, a rough wool thing, and settled on the floor across the hearth from them, his back against the wall. He kept the fire fed through the night, a silent guardian watching over his unexpected, fragile charges. He did not sleep. He just watched the rise and fall of their small chests, a forgotten egg blooming in his own. Days bled into one another in the mountain quiet. Silas established a routine. He would hunt and chop wood while the children slept, returning before they woke. He taught them, with gestures and few words, how to find edible berries, how to read animal tracks in the dirt, how to be silent and listen to the forest. He saw the fear slowly begin to recede from their eyes, replaced by a tentative curiosity. Leo started to follow him on his chores, mimicking his movements. Elara, shyer, would watch from the cabin doorway. One afternoon, Silas returned from checking his snares to find Elara sitting by the hearth. She had found a piece of charcoal from the fire pit and was drawing on a smooth, pale piece of birch bark he used for kindling. He stopped in the doorway, watching her, unseen. She was drawing monsters. Twisted, shadowy figures with sharp teeth and cruel hands. One of them looked unnervingly like Thornton. Her small hand moved with a fierce intensity, capturing her fear on the bark. He did not let her know he had seen. The next day, he left a small, sharp knife and several large, clean pieces of bark on the table before he left. When he returned, she had drawn again. This time, it was the cabin. The fire. The tall pine trees outside. And in the corner, a large, broad-shouldered figure, drawn not as a monster, but simply as a tall, watchful shape. A crack appeared in the wall around his heart. That evening, as he sat by the fire mending a leather strap, he felt a small presence beside him. It was Leo. The boy pointed to a small object on the mantelpiece, a half-finished carving of a wolf. "What is it?" Leo's voice was a whisper, the first full sentence he had spoken to Silas. Silas picked up the carving, his fingers tracing the lines of the wood. His own voice was rough from disuse. "A toy," he said. He swallowed, the next words feeling like stones in his throat. "For my boy." He did not say more. He did not need to. Leo looked from the toy to Silas's face, and in the flickering firelight, the boy saw the deep, unending sadness there. He understood. He reached out a small hand and patted Silas's arm, a gesture of comfort that was so pure, so unexpected, it almost broke him. Ilara, who had been watching, crept over. She held out a new drawing. It was a portrait of him. She had captured the sadness in his eyes, but also the strength in his jaw. She had drawn him not as a giant or a shadow, but as a man. He took the drawing, his hand trembling slightly. It was the first gift he had received in 5 years. Down in Redemption Gulch, Mr. Thornton was seething. He had discovered the true nature of his loss. The twins were not just 2 indentured servants he had profitably offloaded. They were linchpins in a far grander scheme. His contract with the Transcontinental was built on lies. He was being paid by the head for workers he supplied, but more importantly, the railroad was awarded vast tracts of federal land based on the number of employees it maintained in new territories. Thornton had been padding his rosters for months, creating phantom workers to secure lucrative land grants which he and his associates planned to sell off for a fortune. The twins, Leo and Ilara, were the only real children on a ledger full of fraudulent names. They were his proof, his alibi, should a federal inspector ever come sniffing around. Without them, his entire house of cards was in danger of collapsing. The Mountain Man hadn't just bought 2 contracts, he had stolen the keystone of Thornton's crooked empire. Fury propelled him into the sheriff's office. "That savage from the mountain has stolen company property," he roared, slamming his fist on Sheriff Brody's desk. 2 children, under legal contract to the railroad. He kidnapped them right off the platform. Sheriff Brody was a weathered, thoughtful man who had seen enough of the world to be skeptical of loud men in fancy suits. He leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. "Now, hold on, Thornton. What I saw was a transaction. You took his gold. He coerced me. He's a dangerous lunatic. I want you to ride up there and retrieve them. It's your duty as the law in this town." Thornton's face was slick with sweat, his eyes wide with a desperate, greedy light. Brody stroked his chin. He disliked Thornton and the arrogance of the railroad, but the man was waving legal papers. The law was the law, even when it felt wrong. "I'll look into it," he said, his tone non-committal. "I'll ride up to Silas's place and get his side of things." Thornton was forced to be satisfied with that, for now. He stormed out, leaving the sheriff to ponder the ugly business. A few days later, necessity drove Silas back down the mountain. The children needed warmer clothes, and his flour sack was nearly empty. He left them in the cabin, the door barred, with strict instructions not to open it for anyone. He hated leaving them, a raw, protective anxiety gnawing at him. In the town's general store, he felt a hand on his arm. He turned to see Martha, the retired school teacher, a woman with kind eyes and a spine of steel. She was one of the few townspeople who had ever offered him a kind word in the past. "Silas," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Thornton is back. He's telling everyone you kidnapped those children. He's trying to force the sheriff to go after you." Silas's jaw tightened. He merely nodded, gathering his supplies. "It's not just the children, is it?" Martha pressed, her gaze sharp. "I've heard whispers about Thornton for months. About land grants and railroad schemes. Those children are worth more to him than just their labor. I suspect their names are on a document that could ruin him." Silas stopped, looking at her. He saw wisdom and an unwavering sense of justice in her face. He had been alone for so long, he had forgotten what it was to have an ally. "He has a ledger," Silas said, the words coming out in a low rasp. "In the station office." Martha nodded, as if he had confirmed her deepest suspicions. "Then that is what you need. The town is afraid of the railroad, Silas. But they are not without a conscience. They saw what happened on that platform. They saw the fear in those children's eyes. Show them proof of Thornton's villainy, and they will stand with you. Her words gave him a direction, a strategy beyond just hiding in the mountains. He needed to fight back, not just for the children's safety, but for their permanent freedom. He had to expose the rot at the heart of Thornton's authority. That night, Redemption Gulch was quiet under a blanket of stars. A single lamp burned in the railroad station office, where Thornton was poring over his falsified documents, trying to figure a way out of his predicament. Silas moved through the darkness like a ghost. He was in his element here, in the shadows and the silence. He had a plan, aided by an unexpected network of allies. Earlier, he had spoken to the blacksmith, a barrel-chested man named Gus whose children had once been Martha's students. Gus had seen the transaction. He'd seen Thornton's cruel face. "Just tell me when," he'd grunted. Now, on the far side of town, a sudden clamor erupted. Shouts and the clang of metal on metal. It was Gus, staging a loud, dramatic argument with his apprentice over a supposedly broken wagon wheel. It was enough. Thornton and the deputy he'd hired to guard the station rushed out to investigate the disturbance. The office was empty. Silas slipped inside, silent as a moth. He found the ledger on the desk. It was just as Martha had suspected. A long list of names, most of them clearly fabricated. And there, at the bottom of a page detailing the workforce for the Pine Ridge expansion, were two names that made his blood run cold: Leo, orphan indenture number 734. Elara, orphan indenture number 735. Beside the entry was a note, required for Section 12 land grant verification. He took the ledger. He did not run. He simply melted back into the night, the damning evidence tucked securely inside his coat. While Silas was securing the town's legal salvation, Martha was working on its soul. She went to the baker's wife, a woman whose heart was as soft as her bread. "You saw those children, Mary. You have a daughter Elara's age." Mary wrung her hands. "But Thornton, the railroad, they could ruin my husband's business. And what kind of town are we if we let a man like that buy and sell children to line his own pockets?" Martha's voice was gentle but firm. "What do we tell our own children when they ask what we did?" The next morning, a basket appeared on the path leading to Silas's cabin. It was filled with fresh bread, a hunk of cheese, and two small, knitted woolen hats. A quiet offering. An act of solidarity. Back in the cabin, a fragile peace had settled. Elara spent her days drawing, her art transforming. The monsters were gone, replaced by images of the forest, of a smiling Leo, of a huge bear that looked remarkably like Silas, standing guard over two cubs. Leo, emboldened, asked Silas the question he'd been holding in his heart. "What was she like?" "Your wife." Silas was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. The children waited, patient. "Her name was Anya," he finally said, his voice thick. "She loved the mountains. She said they sang to her." He looked at Leo, then at Elara. "And my son, his name was Caleb. He was strong and brave. Like you, Leo. And he had a kind heart. Like you, Elara." It was a confession, an opening of the deepest wound. In that moment of shared sorrow, the space between the three of them closed. They were no longer a man and two wards. They were a trio of survivors, bound by grief and a burgeoning, unspoken affection. The next day, Sheriff Brody rode up the mountain trail. He did not come with a posse, but alone. Silas met him outside the cabin, the ledger held loosely in one hand. The children watched from the doorway, frightened. "Silas," Brody said, his face grim. "Thornton's forcing my hand. He's called a public hearing for tomorrow. He's brought a lawyer from the city. He means to have those children back." Silas simply held up the ledger. "I'll be there." The air in the town hall was thick with tension. It was packed. Nearly every citizen of Redemption Gulch was there, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a stubborn resentment. They were squeezed onto benches, standing along the walls. Thornton stood at the front, flanked by a slick, smug-looking lawyer in a city suit. He looked confident, triumphant. He had the law, the papers, and the power of the railroad behind him. Silas stood alone on the other side of the room. He seemed out of place in the crowded hall, a piece of the wild mountain carved into human form. He was silent, his stillness a stark contrast to Thornton's agitated energy. The children sat on a small bench just behind him, Elara clutching a roll of birch bark drawings. The hearing began. Thornton's lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth and condescending. He painted a picture of Silas as a feral, dangerous recluse who had abducted two helpless children, wards of the powerful and benevolent Transcontinental Railroad. He presented the original indenture contracts, legally signed and sealed. The law is clear, the lawyer concluded, gesturing to the papers. These children are property of the company until their contract is fulfilled. Mr. Thornton, as the company's agent, is their legal guardian. We demand their immediate return. Thornton stepped forward. This man, he sneered, pointing a trembling finger at Silas, is a kidnapper. A savage who lured these children away with threats and intimidation. They must be returned to my care, for their own safety. All eyes turned to Silas. Sheriff Brody, acting as magistrate, cleared his throat. Silas. Your response? Silas was not a man of words. He stepped forward and placed the contracts he had purchased on the table. Then, beside them, he placed the heavy ledger. He opened it to the page with the fraudulent names. This is a lie, Silas said, his voice echoing in the silent hall. He pointed to the names. These people do not exist. He then pointed to the entry for Leo and Elara. He was not buying workers. He was buying proof for a land fraud. He treated them not as people, but as numbers in a book. Thornton's face went pale. The lawyer began to bluster about forged evidence and slander, but a murmur was already sweeping through the crowd. They knew those names were fake. They knew every soul in the county. But the final, damning evidence did not come from the ledger. It came from a child. Sheriff Brody looked at the two children huddled behind Silas. His gaze softened. Elara, he said gently. Can you tell us what happened? All heads turned. Elara froze, her small face a mask of terror. She looked at the crowd, at the furious face of Thornton, and shrank back. Silas turned slightly and caught her eye. He did not smile, but his gaze was a bedrock of steady strength. It said, I am here. You are safe. She took a deep breath. Clutching her drawings, she stood up and walked to the front of the room. Her voice was a tiny whisper at first. We were hungry, she began. He? Mr. Thornton, he didn't give us much food. He said we were cargo. Her voice grew stronger, clearer, fueled by the truth. He told us we were worthless. That no one wanted us. That we belonged to the railroad now. We were scared. She then unrolled her first drawing and held it up for the town to see. It was the image she had drawn in the cabin's hearthlight, two small, stick-thin children crying on the station platform, while a huge, monstrous shadow with Thornton's face loomed over them, its hands like claws. A collective gasp went through the hall. The drawing was crude, childish, but its emotional power was undeniable. It was a portrait of pure terror. Then, Elara held up a second drawing. This one showed the mountain cabin. A warm, bright fire burned in the hearth. Two small figures slept peacefully on a quilt. And sitting by the fire, his back to the viewer but his presence radiating protection, was the large, broad-shouldered figure of Silas. The story was there for everyone to see, more powerful than any legal document or angry denial. It was a story of cruelty and kindness, of fear and safety. Martha stood up from her seat in the front row. We saw it, she said, her voice ringing with moral authority. We all saw how he treated them. We saw them flinch from his touch. We are a town of families. We will not stand by and see children treated like cattle. Gus the blacksmith stood up. Aye. She's right. The baker's wife, Mary, stood. They belong here. With him. One by one, the people of Redemption Gulch rose to their feet, a silent, unmovable wall of community conscience. They stood with Silas. Thornton's authority, built on paper and fear, crumbled into dust. Sheriff Brody looked at the ledger, at the drawings, at the faces of his townspeople. He slammed his gavel down. Case dismissed, he declared. Then he looked sternly at Thornton. Mr. Thornton, you are under arrest for suspicion of fraud against the United States government. Thornton sputtered, his face collapsing in defeat as two deputies moved to take him into custody. His reign of petty tyranny was over. Outside the town hall, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows. The townsfolk streamed past, but this time, their looks were not of suspicion, but of respect. They nodded at Silas. Martha stopped and gently squeezed Ilara's shoulder. You were very brave, she whispered. When they were alone, Silas, Leo, and Ilara stood together in the quiet street. The legal fight was done, but an unspoken question hung in the air. What now? Silas looked down at the two small faces turned up to his. His heart, a place he thought was a cold, dead ruin, felt full to bursting with a fierce, terrifying, wonderful new emotion. It was love. Ilara's small hand slipped into his large, calloused one. Her touch was hesitant, but her grip was firm. Are we going home now? She asked, her voice soft. The word Homer was a prayer. Silas felt a knot in his throat. He could only nod. Then Leo, who had been silent, stepped closer to his other side. He looked up at the tall mountain man, his eyes clear and full of a light Silas hadn't seen there before. It was hope. Dad? Leo asked. The single word struck Silas with the force of a physical blow. It shattered the last of the ice around his heart. It was a name he never thought he would hear again. A ghost on his lips, now a question from a child who needed him. The stoic mask he had worn for 5 years finally cracked. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime and sorrow on his cheek. He knelt, his knees hitting the dusty ground, and pulled both children into a crushing embrace. He buried his face in their hair, smelling the faint scent of wood smoke and sunshine. He couldn't speak. He didn't need to. His arms around them, holding them tight against the world, was the only answer they would ever need. Weeks later, the mountain cabin was transformed. It was no longer a monument to grief, but a cradle of life. 2 small, neatly made beds stood against one wall. Ilara's drawings were tacked up, a vibrant gallery of forest creatures and happy scenes. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with the soft murmur of children's voices and the sound of laughter. Leo, now sturdy and confident, helped Silas chop wood, his small axe rising and falling in imitation of the man he now called Dad. Ilara sat on the porch, teaching herself to read from a set of schoolbooks brought up the mountain by Sheriff Brody himself, a gift from Martha. One evening, as the fire crackled and the wind howled its lonely song outside, Silas sat at the table. He was carving. Not a wolf of sorrow, but 2 new figures. For Ilara, a small, playful bear. For Leo, a clever, watchful fox. He worked with a quiet smile on his face, a sight as rare and beautiful as a sunrise on the highest peak. The mountain had once been his escape from a world of pain. Now, it was a sanctuary, a fortress of love for the found family he would protect with his very life. He had lost a family to a fire, and now, from the ashes of another's cruelty, he had built a new one. A home built not on blood, but on choice, courage, and a love as solid and enduring as the granite peaks that watched over them.